Hey, welcome back to the Gilbertson Aero Factory. Today is Friday, 2nd of January, 2026. Continue working on the left flap today. This is left flap redemption part 3. We got a lot of this stuff done yesterday, but today what we need to do is get the nut plate mounted to the inboard rib and underneath. This plate, it's actually half and half. One leg of the nut plate mounts to the bracket here, and the other part directly to the web of the rib. Goes on the inside here. We need to get that done and then upsize this hole to 1/4 inch. And then the other important stuff that we have to do is we've got to cut this piano hinge to length and then drill it because it doesn't have any holes in it. And it needs holes in it because this is actually what holds the flap onto the airplane. So I'm told that that is important. And following that, we need to machine countersink all these holes on the bottom of the spar, because if we machine countersink these, we don't have to dimple these. And I'm going to take a page from Tim's book and figure out how to do that machine countersinking on the drill press. Probably going to take a little longer to get that set up. In fact, I'm sure it will take longer to set up than if I were to just do it the old-fashioned way. But there's a ton more machine countersinking left to do on this airplane, so I will take the time to learn how to set it up that way because it's going to save a ton of time later. So we'll see how far we get. I've got a couple of hours to work today. I ran by Tim's shop this morning to pick up a little nut plate jig, and good gosh, this thing is tight. Pick up a nut plate jig, and that meant, of course, standing around talking for like an hour and looking at the progress on his airplane, because why not? That's what we do. Beautiful weather today. It's the 2nd of January. I said that already. I didn't tell you that it is like 82 degrees. What a weird winter it has been here. Not really a winter at all. Anyways, I'll quit yapping. I'll start building. Let's build an airplane.
Okay, let's jump into it. This is Friday, January 2nd. It was a total of about 3 hours out here. I'm starting with just cutting that piano hinge to the correct length, which I believe is 56 inches on the nose. That piano hinge runs the almost entire width of that spar. There are 2 rivet holes left over that the hinge does not attach to. So very nearly the length of the whole thing. I spend quite a bit of time puzzling over how I'm going to properly measure or drill the holes. The piano hinge is blank, and you have to match drill it to the spar. And what you see me doing right here is I have the old spar, and I am drilling out the old hinge. I'm not going to reuse it. You can't. It's just too soft. And in fact, it's so soft that when I removed the spar from the flap previously, I was able to drill out the rivets enough to remove the rivet head and remove the spar, but the rivets would not push through the hinge the rest of the way to separate it. You have to drill them all the way through, which if you do that, it's a good chance that you're wallowing out the hole and whatever. So why am I doing that? I'm doing it because when I'm trying to puzzle through a problem, I don't think very well if I just stand around and scratch my head. But if my hands are busy, I do think very well. So it was just a menial task that I could do. And in doing so, I struck on the solution. My worry about drilling this thing is that spar is not straight. It's straight when it's clecoed into the flap, because the rest of the structure is holding it straight. But in its natural state, it has a curve to it. But you cannot have it clecoed in and match drill at the same time. It doesn't work that way, especially because the thing has already been built, so the skin has already been dimpled. And so you wouldn't get perfect alignment, those dimpled holes on these ones, which aren't dimpled because we have to countersink them. But it is easy. It is easy enough to just move one hole at a time down the length of the spar, with the hinge clamped in place, and just check the fit of the hinge. It will follow the curve of the spar, no problem, as you go, because it is so soft. And I said in the beginning of the video that I had intended my plan was to set up the drill press so that I could do the countersinking with the drill press the way that Tim does. I didn't do that, and here's why. The instructions say you should, as we're doing here, it says that you should countersink that bottom spar, or the bottom of that spar, so that you can accept the dimples of the skin without the need for also dimpling the piano hinge. But it says that when you do that, you need to attach the piano hinge as you're countersinking, so that the piano hinge, the holes that you've match drilled there, will be a guide for the pilot of the countersink bit, because that material is so thin, the spar, because it is so thin, when you're countersinking it, as you get deeper into the countersink, it's going to want to wallow out unless there's something to trap that pilot. And so there's probably a way, if you are insane, if you're a psychopath, you could probably build some sort of wooden jig that would allow you to run that spar with the piano hinge clecoed in place and run through and countersink it. But I don't have that kind of time. Ain't nobody got time for that. So we're doing it the old-fashioned way, which is how the other few thousand countersinks I have done to this point have been done. Not a big deal. Manual or machine countersinking can be obnoxious and tedious. If you're like me, you're constantly checking the depth of the countersink to make sure that, maybe as that bit dulls, it's not going as deep. And so I have a little coupon of aluminum that has a 3/32 hole drilled and dimpled in the same thickness as that spar, and I check it constantly. So it is time consuming, but I started this a year ago. I've not done any countersinking in a year. It's only this one length of the spar, and I didn't really have to spend much time fussing with finding the right depth, because the last time I used this countersink cage was doing this exact same thing. So it wasn't that bad. It took some time, but it is all done. And I think that this work on Friday was primarily getting this piano hinge situation handled. So one other thing you'll see me do, I think, is, if I haven't done it already, okay, here I'm just doing all the deburring, being a good boy. So as we said before, that piano hinge is what attaches the flap to the airplane. Obviously, there's another half to that hinge, and then a pin that holds the two together. I'm splitting the hinge, the pin in half, so that rather than having one long 56-inch plus length of pin to go through, if you ever need to take this off or put it back on, instead we split it in half and we do a little modification and we add a retainer to the middle of the spar. So that's what you see me working on right there, is adding a nut plate to the middle of the spar, using the little tool that I borrowed from Tim. And by the way, this is isn't what I borrowed it for. I borrowed it for a different nut plate that it doesn't work for. But so now we moved on to Saturday. Although you can barely tell because I wear the same uniform every day, it appears. We're continuing work on mounting that little nut plate that I described in the middle of the spar. I ran over to Tim's house and borrowed a little nut plate jig thingy, which I wasn't, this is not the nut plate that I was thinking about, not the one in the middle of the spar for that retainer, but I was thinking about the nut plate that mounts to the end rib that we talked about. We need to, that heavy bracket, there's a hole that we need to upsize to 1/4 inch, and then we will attach a nut plate, which you just saw me removing from the old end rib. So that's a larger nut plate, and Tim's nut plate jig doesn't work for that. It's a different dimension. But we will talk about that a little bit because I spent a lot of time trying to get it accurate. And the reason is you have a bolt that holds the rod end bearing that it basically attaches the actuator. This is what moves the flap. And that bolt passes through that thick piece of aluminum into that nut plate that is retained, that is mounted to the inboard rib. And it's a snug fit. That bolt, that AN4 bolt and that 1/4-inch hole is a snug fit. And so if the nut plate on the other end is not dead center aligned on that hole, you're going to have problems with that bolt binding, or maybe not even be able to run in. And so what I ended up doing was kind of scouring my shop and finding an AN4 bolt that I can put in there as a dummy. The actual bolt that goes for that application, we don't have it yet. It gets shipped with the fuselage. Anyways, so run the bolt through into the nut plate, and now that becomes a source of truth as for where the center of that nut plate should be, and then we can match drill the other two sides, get it all mounted up. That's what I did. So Saturday, in a nutshell, run out to Tim's to borrow that thing. In reality, it's 45 minutes there, 45 minutes back, and 45 minutes of shooting the breeze and looking at his airplane and talking the way that we do. So that left me with a couple of hours, I think, on Saturday afternoon to get some stuff done here, which I did. I got it done. I was able to get those nut plates mounted and get to the point where we could get all these parts finally prepped. And by that, meaning get them deburred, cleaned, primed, and ready for final riveting for the second time, as it were. Let's see. What am I doing here? Oh, that bracket that we talked about that mounts to the inboard rib, it sits flush and parallel with the bottom flange of that rib, which means that it also meets the skin right there. And you saw me going back and forth quite a bit with a file into the Scotch-Brite wheel to trying to really shave that thing down, because it can leave an ugly little mark on the skin if it protrudes even the tiniest amount. And I did all that work to make sure it didn't happen. And then when I look at the flap itself, well, that was already there from the first time I did it. So it's on the bottom of the airplane. So if I'm flying overhead at 200 miles an hour, you're probably not going to notice it. But anyways, that's what that was all about. So we've talked about priming on this channel before, but just to reiterate, if I left all this as raw aluminum, it would still live longer than I do, but I am going ahead and priming this here because I primed the other parts on the other side. Probably won't do the same thing when we get into the fuselage, but found a spot where primer wasn't going to blow all over my truck or my garage door, and that does it for Saturday. We move into Sunday. A full 5 hours. You only get to see 4 of them because the camera died at the last part. And you can see that it's no longer 82 degrees, which was a nice change. But the parts are prepped, ready to go. I think, did I go out to Tim's on Sunday? I did. I went and returned his tool to him and chatted a little bit more about modifications to floorboards, floor pans, and stuff like that. But this was the home stretch of getting this thing finally riveted all together. So the first thing that you need to do, well, the first thing that I need to do, because all the rest of it you can see is riveted in front of you, is that aluminum angle bracket, the portion of it that mounts to the front side of the spar. We need to get that mounted up, making sure that we're only riveting the 5 holes that that we originally made when we created that, but leaving open the holes that are going to affix to the flange of the inboard rib, obviously. So that went fine. And then the next thing is to get that, and this is really important, you have to make sure that that flat piece, the kind that's around the corner, the big fat one that goes on the inboard rib, you have to get the nut plate mounted and get that thing entirely affixed to that inboard rib, because once you install the rib, you will not be able to get in there to set rivets. That's important. So the plans say before you close the door, so to speak. Getting those all in, set, done. There was no drama. This is me actually setting the little nut plate, that little modification that we talked about before. I'll show that modification in greater detail later on when I fabricate the little retainer that's going to be mounted right there, and cut the piano hinge pins and do all that. Then I'll go into it in more detail. So now that the front spar is fully prepped and the end rib are fully prepped, it's time to insert the end rib, get that riveted in toward the trailing edge of the flap. The last two rivets are blind rivets, MK319, I think, and you have to upsize those holes just a little bit to get those to fit, and then the rest of them are buck rivets, and it's a pretty tight spot in there. The first two or three that you need to reach back in there. So I'm fortunate to have a variety of bucking bars that can work for that purpose. I think this total session, there were 3 or 4 rivets that I just wasn't happy with that I drilled out, including one that was an old one. That as I was working on this, I decided there was a rivet that I didn't like on the other end rib, which was easy to replace. So once the rib is fully installed, then we will get into installing the spar. And the spar is a little bit weird because when you see me float up there, you see that's the top skin of that flap has a big curve that rolls over the top. And so when you're trying to get the spar installed and trying to place the blind rivets that are underneath that overhang, it's awkward. Even with the little angle tool for setting hard to reach blind rivets, it's awkward, but it all turned out. So I guess I can't really complain. You see me go back and forth to the plans. Since I'm building this flap for the second time, I'm super careful about double checking my work, selecting the correct rivet sizes and whatnot. The only real snafu, and you see me dealing with it right here, is that when I built this new spar, I forgot to upsize the holes that mount the interior rib flanges to the spar. So I got it all clecoed in and was getting started and realized this isn't going to work. So I pulled it out, upsized those holes, and everything's matchy-matchy. And now we'll get in there, and you'll kind of see that skin flex here in a minute when we get into the ones that are at the top of the flange. Right now, what I just did was I set the three that caused me to destroy this thing in the first place. The ones that attach the end rib, everything was fine. Everything turned out great. And the truth is, those don't even really need to be in there. And I didn't like one of them, so I destroyed the whole freaking thing. So you can't really tell. It doesn't appear dramatic as you're watching this, but these are the last few and the most difficult ones of that. Those all turned out fine. So now we can finally get into riveting the span-wise, riveting the skin to the spar, which will completely close it out. So I'll do the bottom of the spar using the foot pedal, which was great. because it helped me work around carefully around that piano hinge. And then the top, we buck them all. The camera's going to route. You're not going to see that part, but it is done. The left flap is done.